Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on which part of the globe you're joining us. Welcome to the 7th ONGEA Eastern Africa Music Summit. Today, we're talking about anti-piracy, the new normal, and we're basically having conversations around the new normal and how COVID impacted the entertainment business and everything that we're doing. Now, before I introduce my fabulous panel, allow me to just shed some light on some interesting facts around piracy. Well, one interesting thing that I noted when I tried to go on Google and check out piracy in Africa, the first thing that popped was piracy in regards to Somalia. So that just says something in terms of how we as Africans think about piracy and how piracy in the IP context, the intellectual property context, is viewed. However, some of the most interesting publications that have been done are mostly from the US and Australia. And the position of piracy at the moment in terms of statistics are that the US is the global leader with about 13.5 billion visits to pirate websites in 2021. There were about 182 billion visits to pirate websites worldwide in 2021. 67% of all pirate websites are hosted in North America and Western Europe. Another interesting statistic that I came about was that in 2020, major Fortune 500 companies paid almost $100 million for advertisements on pirate operators. That tells us something. Again, in 2020, a major positive impact or decision that we noted is that the Pirate Bay can't be accessed in the Netherlands following a court decision. I think as we have this conversation, one thing that's really obvious is that as Africa, we have to start documenting in terms of the impact of piracy and the numbers. We really need to start talking about numbers. So now I'll proceed to introduce our amazing panel. We have Holly Lance who's joining us from the US. We have Chola Gamade from South Africa. We have Angela Ndambuki from Kenya, and she'll talk more about herself as well. And we have Mike Strano, who's representing the East Africa region as well as Australia. So I think first things first, I'll ask my panelists to briefly just talk about themselves and their organization and the role that they play in the intellectual property, in the entertainment space, and matters piracy in terms of how they support anti-piracy issues. So we'll start with our visitor from the farthest, Holly Lance. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so pleased to be here with this esteemed group of panelists. So as Liz mentioned, I'm from the United States. I am from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And sort of where we fit in, particularly, you might be saying, what about in the copyright space? We are part of the Department of Commerce, and we're best known for fostering innovation and economic growth through the registration of trademarks and patents. Like in Kenya, and I know some other countries around the world, our copyright office is separate and they are responsible for registering copyrights. But a lot of our work is actually beyond just registration. We develop and promote reliable, predictable, and high quality intellectual property systems worldwide. And we work both domestically and internationally. So I'm in the Office of Policy and International Affairs, and we play a policy role by serving as IP experts for the rest of the executive branch. So we have a team of attorney advisors. We're divided up by subject matter as well as geographical portfolio. So we have team members in the areas of copyright, trademarks, patents, and enforcement. So I'm on the enforcement team, which means I concentrate on both anti-piracy and anti-counterfeiting matters. And then my geographical region is Sub-Saharan Africa. So on the domestic side, as I mentioned, we serve as the subject matter experts for intellectual property for the rest of the executive branch, particularly when it comes to trade agreements and other activities of the U.S. Trade Representative, such as our annual Special 301 report and Notorious Market List. We also participate in TRIPS Council and review all IP-related issues that might come up in WTO sessions or trade policy reviews. near and dear to my heart is our anti-counterfeiting public awareness campaign called Go For Real, which is directed at tweens and teens and teaching them about the dangers of counterfeit goods. We're also very actively involved in monitoring legislation that touches IP protection and enforcement issues. As some of you all might know, kind of a hot topic right now that's been going in and out of Congress are these ideas of creating some stronger liability, secondary liability for platforms that are selling counterfeit goods. So internationally, we lead the US government in different types of multinational fora, such as WIPO assemblies. We also participate in groups like TM5 and IP5. And we also work with our colleagues and IP offices around the world in formulating strategies and updating IP laws. A large part of our international work also includes training and outreach. For example, I recently got back from Kenya, where I participated in a program with some of my colleagues from other US agencies that focused on anti-counterfeiting strategies with a number of Kenyan government agencies. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly, for that introduction. We go to our next visitor, and I say visitor because hosting from Kenya. So Chola, welcome. Please tell us more about yourself and your organization.
Okay. Thanks, Liz. Good afternoon, morning, evening, everybody. I hope you're well. My name is Chola Makamate, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. I am wearing two hats today. One is as the General Manager for Legal Services at the Southern African Music Rights Organization, which is a collective management organization. Such a fancy term for an organization that really administers copyright. So effectively, we step into the shoes of content creators who are composers and authors in the music space, and we license for the use of their works, and then we administer whatever data we need to administer, and then we pay them over royalties. That's essentially what we do. So that's my job on a day-to-day basis. My second hat is as the chairperson of the Copyright Coalition of South Africa. It's an organization that was formed a couple of years ago in response to legislative developments in the copyright space in South Africa. We've got a very old piece of legislation which is currently being amended. It's been a 10-year process. It's been a very interesting, difficult process because of a lack of understanding of the issues around copyright and how it actually operationalizes on a practical level and just, I think, on a theoretical level as well. We have been very strong advocates of ensuring that we have legislation and a policy environment that is fit for purpose for our context, because in the context of this conversation, a piracy conversation, you need a strong legislative and policy framework in order to ensure that there's compliance, there's enforcement, and you're able to deal with issues around piracy. So that's really what we're doing as the Copyright Coalition of South Africa. But yeah, we'll continue the conversation in terms of what else we're doing as the conversation goes as the Copyright Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up on our panelist list is Angela Ndambuki. Angela, you have the floor.
Thank you, Liz. I'm Angela Ndambuki. I'm currently the IFPI Regional Director for the Sub-Saharan African region. So we handle basically the 46 countries in the region. I also, related to IP, the Vice Chair of the Kenya Association of Music Producers, which is the collective management organization that deals with sound recordings, producers of sound recordings. And I'm also the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry Intellectual Property Committee Chair. Today, I will just speak, because I could speak about all the organizations, but I'll just speak briefly about what IFPI does, because this is my day-to-day job. Basically, we are the trade body and the global voice of the recording industry. We were founded in 1933, but today we have almost over 80 countries representative with over 8,000 members. So we work through our national groups in each country, just basically to ensure that national legislation supports development of thriving creative economies, including establishing sustainable infrastructure for the recorded music industry. So basically, globally, we have our global priorities, which is data and analysis, legal policy, collective management support, content protection and enforcement, international trade, global charts and certification, insights and analysis. It's a long list. But for this particular region, when we began, which was 2 years ago in 2020, we stated that we would just deal with 3 priority areas, and for us, one of them is actually content protection and enforcement. So you can imagine how this is a priority for us. I think it's something that we need to look at, especially on the online environment, and that's why this conversation is very important. The other 2 areas are policy and legal framework, and also the collective management organizations. But of course, we provide also, and we work with priority countries, which is South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, excuse me, Botswana, Ghana, and Nigeria, just because we were starting up the office. But this is on a proactive basis. Doesn't mean that we don't work with the others. We work with others, especially on legislative frameworks, on a reactive basis when they reach out to us. So it's been a good journey, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. And last but not least, on the panelist list is Mike. Mike Strano, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Liz. And it's good to be on a panel where I'm the minority as well, so it's fantastic. So Mike Strano, I am founder of Fat Music and Entertainment, which is a music and entertainment company in Kenya since for the last 23 years, with interest in media, music licensing, event production, and this event here is our event to help build the industry. My newest startup is a company by the name of YAKWETU. YAKWETU does the digital retail and distribution of electronic media. We've started off in movies with a service called My Movies Africa, which is 3 years old this week. We are venturing also into television, online television, virtual reality, podcasts, audio books, and music videos, and eventually gaming. So we have a large interest in terms of the protection of IP and the monetization of IP for our clients who are creatives at the end of the day. I'm also the interim convener of Partners Against Piracy in Kenya, which is a network of international local organizations. We're a coalition. We're formalizing in Kenya at the moment to become an association. And our role is on advocacy and lobbying and enforcement against infringements. We've recently had some successes in Kenya with internet service providers beginning to block sites carrying content that is pirated. So that's a great thing. IFPI, one of our partners in that coalition as well as MYIP with Les is within PAP as well, and Chola is a lead for PAP in South Africa. So there's a lot we're trying to do. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's progress, and looking forward to discussing it a lot more in this session. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we just get into it, I'll be your moderator for today's session. My name is Liz Lenjo. I'm a practicing intellectual property and entertainment lawyer based in Kenya. And I'm also recently the chairperson of the Copyright Tribunal. So today we'll be having some great discussions. And I think first and foremost, let's start with the question, what is new normal? What is the new normal for you in your organization? What has piracy looked like before the digital space as you define what is your new normal? I will start with you, Holly.
Yes, well, I think we're still sort of seeing how things are going to shake out, to be honest. In some ways, I think things changed a lot during the pandemic, and we're still kind of adjusting. So I don't know if we're quite yet at the new normal. In terms of some of the recent kind of trends that we've been seeing in the last couple of years, the first I'd want to name is piracy as a service. That has been an industry that we've really seen growing. And for those who aren't familiar with that, piracy as a service is when organizations, or usually they're criminals, offer these sort of off-the-shelf services that make it easy for would-be pirates to create and operate and monetize their own pirate operation. So it basically drives the creation of new operators of illegal services. The companies offer website templates, they offer libraries, In advertising, they have basically the whole package that makes it easy for people to create their own IP TV services or otherwise, illegal streaming services. And we also have seen, IPTV apps. Those were popular before the pandemic. Those continue to be popular. And now sometimes they're even being kind of included when people buy their equipment. So it makes it easier for consumers in a way to stream pirated content, but it also makes it harder to stop just because it has become so widespread. And in terms of what we do, I think, having strong laws and also just really making sure that we have these criminal actions to deter, these criminals sort of at all levels is going to be really important.
Thanks, Holly. Chola, what's the new normal to you? What does it look like?
So I tend to agree with Holly in the sense that we're still, I think, trying to figure out what that is. And I think from two perspectives, one from a content creator's perspective and one from a consumer perspective. If we're going to talk about pre-COVID, I was thinking you were talking about pirates, and the first thing that came to mind is Somalia. I always say to people, what people sort of think of when they think about piracy, I think in our jurisdiction in particular, is these campaigns that government used to run where they would come and pile up these cassettes and all these goods, counterfeit goods and whatnot, and you're able to show people like, this is what piracy looks like. I think the difficulty now is that you are unable to show people what it looks like. So in that sense, there's a new normal in that regard. And what COVID did is that we were all sitting at home, nothing to do, and all we could do was consume content. And consuming content by any means, whether it was legally or illegally. And I think the challenge that we do have is that a lot of people think content piracy is a victimless act. You can just consume this content, whatever platform you're consuming it as a consumer, how you get it. You don't think about the consequences of what that could be, whether it's something as simple as a content creator not getting their money because you've used their copyrighted material without paying them, or as bad as things around prostitution or a number of dark things or consequences from a content piracy perspective. So there are consequences, but there isn't that understanding and knowledge from a consumer perspective of what that is. From a content creator perspective, I think they've really suffered. They were unable, so everything came to a standstill in our context. There were no performances. People had to automatically adjust to finding other ways of selling their content, other ways of performing, going online, adapting. And, we're not very quick to adapt in our context. And also the issues around access, data. So there are a number of things that, were barriers for content creators in our jurisdiction in particular to be able to continue. Those who could were able to do so. But I think what we found is that people are trying really hard to go back to the old normal, if I can put it that way, because that's what they understand. But I think in this world of disruption, you need to move forward to understand that you need to operate in a digital space, and you need to know how to capitalize on that and monetize your IP. So we're still finding our feet in terms of that. Enforcement, like Holly said, is a very big issue, particularly in a way there aren't strong laws, particularly where the police or any other enforcement officer can't do much about what's happening in the digital space. And also because the digital space is not a physical space. It's one thing to enforce, for instance, at the tavern down the road, when there's copyright infringement or content piracy. But in the digital space, it's a completely different ballgame, and you can't just limit it to a particular jurisdiction. You need to have partners across the globe in order to enforce particular laws or protect content creators. So still finding our feet, but lots of challenges that need to be addressed in order to effectively deal with content piracy.
Thank you, Chola. I'll go to you, Angie, now. Angela?
Well, I would say for the recording industry it would be the digitization, because it's revolutionized how we are consuming music, music consumption, especially, in the last years, as others have said, with COVID. It's been global, because if you look at the IFPI global music reports, you'll find that streaming is actually still king. So you find that the growth of the music industry, recorded music industry, year on year, is being driven mainly by streaming. So, but with this consumption, of course, rights holders are also able to diversify their revenue sources, making proper marketing, to earn more and from online exploitation from their work. So it's really important for us to know that with this, as we say, new normal, there's more opportunities being offered by having more, maybe a bigger market out there to be able to consume this music. For example, you can imagine worldwide, the music companies have licensed millions of recordings to over 350 digital music services, and this will be in over 180 territories. So that means that that's actually your marketplace. So with this, there's at least one licensed online music service, and frequently more in every African country and in most territories around the world. If we talk about Kenya, for example, since we are here, we have Spotify, Boomplay, Mdundo, which is doing very well, just celebrated the 10 years, and among other, of course, legally operating DSPs. And the fact that Spotify is now available in Kenya is also, testament to the potential market that the DSP is looking at. But if you look at increased consumption, basically, it should be understood that within its rightful context, that there are many factors that come to play, and also influencing whether the consumption translates into a meaningful economic gain. And that's where I guess we are discussing these issues today, which is online piracy is a very, very big issue and infringement, which has enabled illegal activities, and especially music, to be able to people to be able to stream rip, for example, stream manipulation, or all these cyber lockers, illegal download platforms. So all these issues that have stemmed from the increased use or consumption of music online and digitalization. So if you look at the case in Kenya, I would say we have, at least as IFPI, just had an overview of what's been happening and the figures that people have been having online, and the issue of online piracy and what it's looking like. And I can just maybe pull out some of these numbers that we had last year. If you allow me to just look at Kenya, from June 2020 to June 2021, there were actually 50.7 million visits to piracy sites. And from June 2021 to June 2022, the number increased to 59.2 visits. So you can see the more, of course, consumption, the more people are able to access to this online space. So bottom line, we have to be able, and as IFPI, we're really working with other partners, as Mike has mentioned, to ensure that we make sure that there is a proper policy and regulatory framework to deal with this. But bottom line is that the digital environment means repertoire, both local and foreign, is easily accessible. Thus, the need to protect the content. So if this is done, then the recorded music industry stands to benefit even more.
Thank you, Angela. Mike, over to you. What does the new normal look like, or what is it in your context?
Yeah, I think new normal actually for Africa goes back a little bit. If we look at the history of piracy, Kenya, again, since I'm based here, I'll just use it as an example. Kenya used to be one of the hubs of the music industry in Africa. A lot of new sounds came out of Kenya. There were vinyl pressing plants in Kenya as well. These were in the days of apartheid in South Africa as well. Of course, South Africa was quite insular. South Africa these days is seen to be where all the record labels are based. But back then, South Africa had its record labels, and then Nairobi had the polygons were here and the like, because this is where it was happening. Then come the cassette tape, and come poor regulations, piracy took over, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s. So Kenya and the rest of Eastern Africa has really suffered from piracy for the last 40 years. So digitization is, and I think all of us here have seen and observed what it takes to manage digital piracy, border patrols and all that sort of stuff. And frankly, it's failed. So digitization, I think, is actually a great thing. It probably didn't come in such a good way with Napster, but that's what prompted, iTunes to come in, and the rest is history. So the normal has been digitization. The new normal, I think, brought on by the pandemic has been hyper digitization. and hyper consumption of digital, especially in Africa. Africa has been a late, because of internet, a late adopter, but a fast adopter of internet. We still have some countries that have a thriving physical piracy market, like Nigeria and Tanzania, for example, and Uganda. But in Kenya, and I deal both in music and in film. In Kenya, there used to be the movie shops, and they've reduced, DVDs have reduced by up to 2/3 in the last few years. Everything is digital. Now, of course, those same movie shops that are left, there's two things. Everyone at home is doing the digital downloads illegally themselves, or they still have their movie guy who's curating for them and putting it on a flash disk. But that has vastly reduced, now down to 1/3. There used to be a statistic of about 300 million DVD imports per year into Kenya, which makes sense with a population of 50 million. That's only six per person, So now, if you actually go online, the best thing about online is, yes, we do get higher consumption, but yes, we actually have an easier way in theory when the internet service providers play their role, which is governed by legislation, groundbreaking legislation in Kenya. It is theoretically an easier way. It's about just turning off the tap. So we do have the right legislation in Kenya. Having it operationalized, because there's a lot of vested interest, has been a challenge. But we're confident as PAP that, using this new legislation and using this new technology, we'll be able to fight back against piracy a lot easier than it has been in the last 40 years, and basically reclaim that money that's sitting there in the hands of pirates. And as Chola says, it's seen as a victimless crime. Piracy is robbing the creative industry, not just music, in Kenya, of about 92 billion shillings per year. So that's in dollars, about nearly $800 million. That's about $2.2 million per day. So that's an amazing loss to the industry. Imagine what that could do per day as a cash injection into our industry. So I think it's a great opportunity with digital to finally turn that around and put the money into the hands of the creators.
Thanks, Mike. That was a very good and interesting history that you shared. Like, you took us back and, past, present, future. I think that was really awesome. And the one thing that's really obvious right now is that digitization has its pros and cons. We're making money, or at the same time, we're losing money. So in terms of this digital revolution, what would you say are the sort of trends that you're observing in terms of impact and access to content and to music, and vis-a-vis also just any protection mechanism, either personal mechanisms that one can use, legislative mechanisms? What are some of these trends that are there in terms of supporting this digitization and digital revolution? I'll start with you. I think I'll start with Angela.
Okay, I think it's critical first just to understand basically how the whole process. And then I agree with you, Mike. I mean, digitization has been there, but the new normal, basically, especially for our region, is the digitization and online consumption, because it was there, yes, but it was not normal, So, so I think as we look at these issues and what it's done and the shift of music consumption from physical formats to online platform, and us being able to take that as a new normal, is what we need to be able to look at, especially in the last few years. So now that we're here, the fact that has also led to online piracy, and this has actually now it's becoming a menace in the recorded music industry. It actually hurts, of course, the online consumption and formats, including streaming and downloads. So for us, of course, as IFPI, we have been working I already mentioned this, that we have been working on the legislative frameworks, which now would mostly, deal with the ISP obligations. If rights holders, for example, they are losing billions, you've heard the numbers at least from Mike, and the government is also in turn losing millions of unpaid taxes, isn't it? So we have to really work with governments, and I think that's why for IFPI we are partnering, and we have MOUs with, for example, for the region with Nigeria and Kenya, and we're working very closely with those governments to ensure that we are we are decreasing on these numbers. Before I mentioned about the Kenyan numbers, so if you look at Nigeria, for example, which looks a bit positive, is that from January to May 2019, there were like 36.6 million visits to piracy sites. The same period, 2020, the numbers actually rose to 72.9, and then in 2021, same period, numbers actually reduced to 65.5, and also this year numbers have actually decreased further to 54.3. So that shows that, you know, with collaborations and with working together and just having that between the, you know, private sector and governments, because of course the enforcement is the government usually who does the enforcement of that, and it's critical for us to be able to work together to ensure that we are able to reduce all these numbers. The best thing to do with these regulations is to ensure, of course, website blocking, which is a main, it has been, you know, implemented across the world, and it's been a successful way of actually preventing and enforcing on online piracy. And we're hoping that in Kenya also we'll be able to do this. I know Mike would like to talk about the recent case, and I'm sure he'll be talking about that, what has happened with multi-choice. But that was, you know, like a great win for us, President. And I'm hoping that, you know, in the coming, you know, months, we'll be able to see more happening on that front. So I would say that would be a priority in terms of enforcement, would be the blocking. In terms of a trend in just enforcement also in some way is also working in collaboration with both the government, the private sector, and the players, and also generally just looking at data numbers, being able to follow up on that as well.
Thanks, Ange, for that. And I think it's only natural I move forward to Mike, considering we're talking about our region before we move to our visitors. And Mike, I think it would be great for you to now sort of just add on to what Angie said in terms of the trends that we are observing and, you know, some of those mechanisms we've also seen in Kenya, the case that Angela just mentioned. You know, please share more insight in regards to that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really amazing. I think, you know, the best gift that our former president has left the creative industry was the ascent of the Copyright Amendment Bill into law in 2019, and that has Section 35, and Section 35 is around takedown and blocking or have you. And what's really interesting is that the 12th Parliament that assented, who put this forward, then tried to have it repealed last December, and it was really a test for Partners Against Piracy. And you know, as they say, things happen for a reason, and I think we're a stronger organization for it, because we did rally together locally and internationally. We had so much international support, including from the US as well, to basically just, you know, stop this very important provision in the Act from being repealed. If it was repealed, it's akin to legalizing piracy. So there were a couple of things happening simultaneously. So there was that which we managed to overturn, and the sponsor of that bill withdrew it and saw the sense of that, which is fantastic. Then around about the same time, well, after the assent of the Act in the bill in 2019, MultiChoice, which is one of our members, decided immediately to test the law, because they have been losing a lot of revenue due to piracy. Holly recently talked about the set-top boxes and what have you, which were running rife in Kenya at the time, and still are. So they decided to test it. So they followed the process of Section 35. They sent takedown notices to two of the major internet service providers in Kenya, and they were essentially ignored. So they went to court the following month, and that case has been in court for the last 2 years. And finally, I think it was in June, they got a ruling on it that basically said that it's you know, yes, in fact, it is against the law for ISPs not to block a consumer's access to these sites that are actively promoting infringing content. So that was a major case. It's something that we needed. We're very grateful to MultiChoice for having those cases. They have another case coming up next month with the next tier of ISPs, another 3, to further validate that law. Those ISPs may withdraw that case. So right now, and thankfully after that ruling, the 2 ISPs in question, and we can mention them now because the case is out, and that was Safaricom, which is the biggest ISP, and Jamii Telkom. They did go in and they blocked some sites. And we're continuing to engage them now as PAP with a conveyor belt of infringing IPs to continue to be blocked. It will take a while for the impact to be felt, but it is a good positive step. And what's interesting is that Safaricom does have its own services as well for retail of film and retail of music. So they've also been suffering from piracy, like the rest of us, like the rest of the creators and the rest of the distributors in the industry. So I believe, slowly but surely, we'll get everyone working together to block it, and it's going to unlock that amount of money in the industry. That will see more job creation, that will see more creation of content, that will see more local and foreign investment, and it can literally turn this industry around overnight. And we hope it will be a very solid case study for the other countries in Africa to also model, and we continue to learn from each other as well. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that. I think I'll move first to Holly, then Chola will give us a perspective on how SA is handling that. And the reason I'm moving on to Holly is because now we've been talking about that whole ISP, secondary liability, how some of these platforms can help in aiding or rather fighting piracy issues, and how they can also support the industry. And for you, Holly, you mentioned that the USPTO has also, and the US in general, has been having conversations around how to make these provisions even stronger. It would be great to hear some of your statistics or experience in terms of how the ISP liabilities, as they have been, how have they served the US economy, and how these proposed changes are going to look like in terms of compliance.
Absolutely. So a lot of the recent legislation that's being proposed is actually more on the counterfeit side. So I do want to just make that distinction there, that when I'm talking about platform liability, I'm generally talking more about the Amazons and eBays of the world, those large e-commerce marketplaces, and what kind of liability they have for the sale of counterfeit products. So products that falsely bear a brand. That said, I think that, I think someone used the word hyperdigitization. And I think all countries, including the United States, have really had to come to grips that a lot of our, current IP laws aren't really up to snuff for this new digital world of streaming. So one thing that I'm particularly happy about is that at the end of, I believe it was the end of 2020, we passed the Protect Lawful Streaming Act, which now makes it a felony for the large scale distribution through streaming of copyrighted content. Previously, only unlawful reproduction and distribution was considered a felony. So we have those higher penalties now. The other thing I'm seeing kind of as a larger trend, not so much with the United States law shifting, but with a lot of the African countries, is really tightening up the laws around technological protection mechanisms. I know this can get a little bit in the weeds here, but technological protection mechanisms are different digital sort of locks that people can put on their works to prevent it from being copied or distributed or otherwise tampered with. Sometimes an analogy we use is if you have a library, the library contains all the copyrighted content, and these technological protection mechanisms, or TPMs, are kind of the locks outside the door. So when you violate a TPM, it's a little bit different, or we consider it a little bit different than violating the copyright, because it's really like you're a burglar trying to get into the library. But it's still very much a crime and a violation. So one thing we've been working on with a lot of countries, including looking at the law in South Africa as well. I know that's one of the issues that it's being discussed with that law, or has been discussed for a long time, is what the role is of liability for the violation going around these technological protection mechanisms. So that's sort of an area that I think we're sort of focusing on as we realize that we're really not going back to the cassettes or the DVDs. It's all about streaming and digital, and figuring out how do we sharpen the tools we already have or create new tools to address these kind of violations that are sort of next to, but not exactly, copyright infringement.
Thanks, Holly. So to you, Chola, it would be great to hear the South African perspective in terms of the mechanisms that you have in law. Is your copyright law, assisting in this quest to fight piracy online? And if not, what are some of the things that your people are doing on the ground just to protect themselves?
Okay, thanks, Liz. South Africa, I'm sad to say, is moving backwards with how the current amendment bill is drafted. I think at a basic level, it's creating very fertile ground for even users to not comply with any sort of copyright compliance. It's taken what is supposed to be a nice, delicate balance between users and creators and shifted it strongly in favor of the user. So from that perspective, from a content creators perspective, their protection at a basic level with the way the bill is currently drafted, honestly been taken away, which then means if you're going to deal with the broader issues, for instance, like piracy that we're discussing, makes it fertile ground in South Africa for piracy to be rampant. And we saw the trends with COVID. Like I said, there's nothing else to do but consume, in particular, creative content. So people were consuming music, people were watching videos, people were watching films. They were consuming all of the stuff, and where they were sourcing from was legal or illegal, depending on who you spoke to. But I think the vast majority of people want a freebie. That's consumers. They want to get content for as little as possible, for nothing at all, because and I'll keep saying this, they see it as a victim. They don't even see it as a crime. And they don't see that they're any victims. For them, they want to get this content and be able to consume it. And unfortunately, we have this piece of legislation that's being amended that's going to make it very easy for consumers, for big tech users in particular, in the digital space, to use content at will without compensating creatives on the ground. And I mean, look, like I said, it's been a long journey. It's been over 10 years that this process has been ongoing. We reached a milestone at the beginning of September where the bill was passed in the National Assembly, but now it's going through another process, that's outlined in our constitution in terms of consulting various stakeholders, that we do, at least make an effort to have a bill that's fit for purpose and protects content creators. And it maintains that balance between content creators and users in South Africa. But like I said, we seem to be moving very much backwards, and it's really heartening to hear, the Kenyan story, where there are moves in the right direction. And one can only hope that our legislatures can learn from that. But I mean, on the ground, really, we are pushing hard. We're advocating for a fairer process, for the legislative process to be respected. We're pushing really, because education is a big issue here. It is a massive issue. People don't understand copyright. They don't understand, copyright infringement. They don't understand piracy. They don't understand, the value chains. That they don't understand the harm that's caused by consuming this content illegally. So that's a huge hurdle that we have to jump over in our jurisdiction. From a consumer side, we need that education to happen, because what we've learned really is that if there isn't, this groundswell of revolt from the consumer themselves or the citizenry, then our lawmakers tend to do what it is that they want to do. So that's something that we're really trying to do. But from a trends perspective, there's been, proliferation of pirate sites, number of visits there increasing. I think Kenya is number one in terms of visits to pirate sites, and South Africa is second. Last time I checked the stats, but you might find South Africa overtaking, because at least in Kenya there are enforcement mechanisms in the law, like Holly said, not enough attention being paid to TPMs, things that can assist, not enough attention being even paid to piracy. As a concept. And I think also what we do have in our jurisdiction is you have different government departments looking at the same issue in very divergent ways. So our Department of Trade and Industry is the one that's drafted this horrible piece of legislation. But you have our Department of Justice, on the other hand, talking about effective anti-piracy measures and wanting to curb piracy. But these are people all sitting around the same table. So there's a lot of work to be done from an advocacy and education perspective in our jurisdiction. I'm really hoping that, the Kenyan example is something that we can truly learn from and try and implement here, because ultimately it is about protecting content creators and allowing them the ability to make money and exploit their works.
Thanks, Chola. Now we've talked about the TPMs, technological protection measures. These are digital mechanisms. And now we're seeing a lot of conversations around blockchain, artificial intelligence, what they're calling Web3, all these fancy words. And I think it would be great to hear insights and thoughts around what could look like the future of fighting piracy. How maybe can we strengthen these TPM provisions? So I think I'll start with you, Holly, because you come from a jurisdiction that is highly proactive, very innovative in terms of AI and blockchain. And just tell us your thoughts. What are people saying in the industry? Are there any technologies that are already in use that we can sort of start hearing about and borrow from?
Absolutely. Well, I definitely think Web3 and blockchain, NFTs, these are all things that people are really excited about. I think not really just in the United States, but worldwide. And I think there's a lot of promise and potential in the area of copyright protection and enforcement in this space. So a couple of things that I've seen proposed, and I don't know how popular they are yet, is the idea of using NFTs, these non-fungible tokens, as a way of tracking and distributing, music and other types of creative works. So, for example, you could tie music or movies, other digital content, to smart contracts that provide the owners of that content a digital token. They would have those access rights, and any attempts to make changes to that digital asset or the rights management information attached to that asset would be made public on the blockchain. So it creates a lot more transparency. The other promise, and this is, I know, particularly something that's of interest to visual artists, is this idea of secondary royalties. So an artist, when they're first up and coming, they sell their work to the public, and they don't make that much money. But as they become more popular, that work gets on the resale market and it sells for 5 times as much as that initial sale. The idea is that if you could track that sale or connect your smart contract so that the artist automatically receives a royalty with each additional sale, is really a wonderful opportunity for artists to continue to benefit from and generate revenue with each sale of their artwork or music. So another thing that I think blockchain technology could be useful for within copyright area is for infringement disputes. So now, what the court's going to use to evaluate whether a item is indeed eligible for copyright or whether 2 works are substantially similar, that's going to vary from court to court. And those are going to be somewhat subjective determinations, but blockchain technology could provide a time-stamped and sort of immutable proof of creation, provide verification of authorship, date of creation, and terms of use. So if you create a work, it could be embedded into a token that will provide, a sort of tamper-proof evidence of who created the work, when the work was created, where it was created. So particularly when we're looking at disputes regarding who created something first, that could be really useful. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that being widely adopted yet in our courts. However, I have heard about that in China, which I think is really interesting in my research, that some of the courts there are now allowing blockchain to be used for sort of proof of evidence in court. And there was one other thing I looked into that I thought was kind of interesting with regard to anti-piracy campaigns. Microsoft did some research. They published a paper, and I can put it in the chat. It's called Argus, a fully transparent, incentive system for anti-piracy campaigns. It's an Ethereum-based public blockchain that would pay anonymous informers for reporting copyright infringement. So this is kind of interesting. The way this works is that the copyright owner would distribute copies of their work to authorized licensees with unique watermarks that correspond with the secret code. And then when a pirated copy is reported by an informer, then the sort of the pirate or the person who leaked the code would then have their status changed to accused. Now, I have a little bit of questions about the morality of this and people calling out other people for piracy, but I do think it's an interesting concept. I'll put a copy of this concept paper in the chat. It's something worth looking into in terms of incentivizing people to not release copyrighted works.
Thanks, Holly, for that input. So I'll move on to Angie. Mike, you'd like to say something?
I can't see where I'm using bad manners. I should be putting my hand up somewhere. I can't find the control. I will. I just wanted to comment because it was topical about NFTs. I think one of the best things about NFTs is because of all the hype, everyone all of a sudden is a creative. So finally, all the consumers understand where the creatives are coming from. So what's very interesting is that I attended the Kalasha market here a few months ago, and we exhibited as My Movies Africa. So we're explaining to some young students from Kenya Film School what our service does. So our service is you either rent or what we call own for life. You can purchase a digital copy, it's encrypted, it can't be pirated. So it's the old kind of iTunes model, Amazon model. Everyone else has gone streaming. We've gone against the grain because we still believe there's a market for it, because how many subscriptions can you afford? And what's very interesting, so the student turns around and says, so this own for life, is it an NFT? And it just got me thinking, and this is a 20-something, and this is what they have been born into, that to have a digital copy of anything, and as our company, we will be moving towards blockchain. But they've been born into this thing that, yes, now digital content has value, and it has value when it's an NFT, when it always did have value. But we're kind of giving a different purpose to it, which was very interesting because I think it will help us in our advocacy with consumers, that once we get into Web3 and we start talking about music as NFTs and films as NFTs, they will understand that, oh, actually, an NFT is like a title deed to land. And this is something we've been telling the world forever, but they just don't understand it. So I think I really do hope that this sense of entitlement of having free content all of a sudden starts to dissipate a little bit, because what we find is a little bit different to the rest of the world. Well, I grew up in Australia, and I knew that pirating was wrong from a very young age. You just had this understanding, this sense of right and wrong about property, whether it was physical property or intellectual property. Somehow it was in our education system from a very early age. And that's something that we don't have in Africa. You barely learn it at university, so this sense of entitlement is there, that it's free. And it's the same with music and culture anyway. It's even the same as live performances. So we need to turn that around. But I think actually Web3 in terms of a narrative could actually help us turn that misperception around, or help contribute to it anyway. So that's what I just wanted to contribute on the back of, and it's kind of what Holly was saying, calling people out. It's a name and shame, name and shame, embarrass people for pirating content and reward them for doing the right thing. So sorry, over to you, Angela. I'm sure you have a lot to say about that as well.
No, thanks, Mike, for that. At least you enriched that. So, and I have a specific question for Angela, because IFPI is doing something amazing that I think many people in the music industry don't know or hear about, especially the producers. And I want to tell Angie first. Please tell us more about the number that you get when you join IFPI, or when you apply to IFPI. There's a number that they get. So please tell us more first about that, because I think I understand it also to give it some sort of a digital identity. So I think people need to know more about that. And then once you tell us about that, you tell us more in terms of how maybe in future AI could also help that become a more robust system for the recording industry.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Okay, so the code is the ISRC, the International Standard Recording Code. Basically, it's just it has its prefixes and the numbers. It has a format of which it's followed. But basically, as you said, it's a digital print. It's like a fingerprint of your recording. So basically, where it's played in the world and it's be able to be picked, we can know that who are the rights holders, or the people, or the producer, or which song is being played, the recording being played. The music recording being played. So yes, it is an essential, part in terms of just distributing music, and it's very important for us, especially we've launched it in Sub-Saharan Africa region, and we are doing it as the office here. The only other agents that we have in Sub-Saharan Africa is South Africa, which is done by RISA. So we are hoping that eventually we'll have individual territorial agents or managers of the ISRC, because of course eventually it will be too much for our office, which is quite small, to be able to take it on. But in the meantime, we're able to manage. Moving on to just basically what AI and the new, I would say the new also trends in terms of technology. I would say that maybe the recorded music industry, it's actually exploring emerging tech to its advantage. And you can see, as Harley mentioned, the NFTs, the smart contracts. Actually, you find that the music companies are actually the ones who are going out and actually pushing and being at the forefront of digital economies. But if I would differ a bit in terms of blockchain, and especially in terms of the fight against piracy, because what we've seen and been discussing even internally and externally is that there doesn't seem to be a clear anti-piracy angle, at least not for now, but the space is actually innovative, and the member companies are actually engaging in various initiatives. So we feel like the reason why blockchain might not be useful in the fight against piracy is that there's no way of actually keeping like an immutable record, of something, so it can stop the illicit use of that thing outside the system. So, for example, if the record is kept in a particular place, the fact that you can actually trace, or that doesn't actually prevent the piracy from happening. When you talk about AI, for example, the industry is actually using AI directly in content protection and rights management. I told you we have a team in London that actually deals just specifically on content protection and enforcement. If you talk about audio fingerprinting, the pattern and matching, that's actually part of AI, and it's also being used AirPlay monitoring, the fingerprints, as I mentioned. So if you look at that process, and AI can actually be used, and it's actually useful in that area. But something that we haven't touched, which is the new, what everyone is talking about, is the metaverse. It's arguably actually the music industry's next, if not the new frontier as well. So if you talk about the metaverse, Web 3.0, the virtual age, it's revolutionary. It's also revolutionizing how we are consuming music again and again. It's like every time there's something new that's happening, and it's also hard, and especially I'm sure at least right now your brain, as you said, is just moving too fast. I don't know how we're going to keep up with all these new technologies. But in fact, the companies are very active in taking music and other things again to the metaverse. So if you talk about metaverse, you can see anti-piracy can be effective with cooperation, I guess, from other platforms. And because content is stored in databases, even though the environment is on a 3D environment. What will be difficult, I would say, is that, because it's like a decentralized system, where you can't really pinpoint, a single source of where the source is, that it becomes difficult to say website blocking, because everything is just, at the same time. There are also other areas, of course, so it might be a bit of a challenge there, but I'm sure as we go along, we'll be able to, find more ways of how to deal with anti-piracy moving forward. And the other ways, of course, in areas of content protection, where machine learning, for example, can be used, and maybe it's already being used, the digital services, to catch the indicators of streaming manipulations, for example. So much technology happening, so many things to look at, up to. So all these things that we're talking about, like now the website blocking, will become harder and harder with that decentralized system. Moving, if you look at now the journey of internet, to web 1, I don't know, 2, 3 now, so it's really something that we'll have to play catch up. And I hope that even the legal framework would be able to, to be, at par as the technology changes. Yeah.
Thanks, Angela. Chola, back to you. AI, blockchain? Are there conversations in South Africa? Are there conversations in the CMO space as you put on your Samro hat? How can we benefit? What could be the potential in terms of these tech innovations?
Thanks, Liz. Look, there are a number of discussions happening in different sort of corners in the creative industry about how to use technology, how to use AI, blockchain, for a varying number of reasons. In the CMO space, one of our biggest challenges is data and how we process data. And the most efficient way for us to process data, because it takes too long, it's too expensive, and ultimately, prejudice to the content creators in terms of them getting their due because of our outdated way of managing data. So there are several discussions happening around how you can use blockchain for that. And I think in terms of also dispute resolution mechanisms, there are a lot of disputes that take place with content creators. And like Holly said, issues around splits, issues around when things were published, issues around who owns what, issues around when an infringement took place. So from an evidentiary perspective, there are conversations happening around that and how you can use that to resolve disputes. And I think with the type of legislation that we're looking at possibly having, we are going to definitely need to use technology, even if it's not in the law. Use technology as a means to effectively deal with issues around copyright infringement, issues around piracy. And I think it's happening. I think Angela makes a good point about the law being able to keep up. The law will never be able to keep up because it takes so long. The processes are just too cumbersome. There's consultation that takes place, and technology evolves basically every day as we speak. And the young people in particular are the ones who are understanding how to use this. And I think at some point, I know I keep saying, policy legislation is important, but at some point, I think that will become obsolete. I think there will be a separate world, an alternative world that operates outside of the confines of specific legislation or policy. So there are lots of opportunities. Just listen to everybody speaking here as to how you can use technology, artificial intelligence, one, for better content creation, two, for enforcement, three, for dispute resolution, data processing, dealing with infringement. And I think also Mike also makes an important point, is that people tend to do things because it doesn't affect them. And we see a lot of content creation happening on TikTok. Everybody's a content creator, and people want to make money. And I think when they understand that, listen, you're not going to make money because of some pirate out there, I think it's going to become more of an issue. And then they will be the ones who will be policing the issues around content piracy. So I think it does look bleak from our perspective, but I think just listening to the conversation here, there are a number of opportunities from a technological side that can be taken advantage of if you think strategically, and are able to, plug into places where you can direct certain information or certain conversations about how things need to be done. So even if, for instance, in our context, it might not be in the law, but I do think that there are a number of opportunities to deal with content piracy, and using the basic thing of human greed to assist with fighting that.
Thanks, Chola. Before I move on to the next question, just to remind our viewers that we're taking questions as we go along. Please interact with us on the chat. We'll answer your questions. So please feel free. Don't be afraid. We are here for you. So my next question, I will start with Mike, because Mike is the only non-lawyer in the group, and everyone else is wearing also a legal hat on the background. But you're a kind of lawyer.
That's what I was saying. I'm a minority in so many ways.
Yeah. So
okay.
my question.
Go easy on me. All right.
I will go easy on you. But my question is more of, what can the legal system do better or best, or how can it improve to address copyright infringement issues, piracy issues and cases? What do we need to do, or what can the legal system do for you in terms of dispute resolution?
Gosh, Liz, we only have 25 minutes left. But I think there's different levels, right? So there's the lawmakers who are in parliament and the policymakers as well. I would just say, number one, speed, remember you're there to be at service to the citizens and the citizens of the country and the industry. You're not there for yourself, and I hope they're listening. So, speed, and I really do hope we have a new administration in Kenya, and I really do hope that this new administration does embrace speed, and we get back to, I remember in the regime prior to the last one, the government was very active on what they call rapid results initiatives, and these were turning around things in 100 days. And they were an ongoing cycle, and that's why there was a lot achieved over that time. I'm not saying that the last administration didn't achieve a lot, but I think there's always room for improvement. So I think speed in terms of lawmaking and consultation, also following due process as well. We found in the last case, and I learned a lot in the last case, and it was really good to be exposed to that. But there's a lot of tricks as well. There's a lot of cloak and dagger. There's a lot of money that gets thrown around and influence that gets thrown around. And it's very important to, what I learned from that experience is, one, it's very important to align yourself to the right people. Two, it's very important to work as a team and to have people who know people. And three, it's very important to know the systems. And four, it's very important to hold people accountable to the systems. So that's probably from our side as industry, but now from the lawmakers, just follow the systems. They're there, follow the law, So speed, integrity in terms of following the law. So that's for the lawmaking. In terms now, Liz, where you are in terms now of, and I'm so happy that you're chairing the tribunal, is for and now let's talk about other jurisdictions. I think Kenya is blessed to have a tribunal now. Is basically to get a lot of these easy to fix cases out of the courts that take forever and into the tribunals, and for the to use tribunals to efficiently have outcomes. And with every positive outcome, there's a positive precedent as well. We've seen, and I know you've handled some of them as well, Liz, we've seen very simple infringement cases being tied up in courts for years, and our creatives are broke. And ironically, they're broke because the same infringements are keeping them broke. But hopefully with the tribunals, we'll be able to resolve these cases a lot faster. We'll be able to have very strong precedents in place. And we're in a jurisdiction, and I don't know what it's like in South Africa, Chola, that we're in a jurisdiction where the most powerful people are the politicians and the businesses. We're in a jurisdiction where impunity reigns. And unfortunately, you can't believe the hype. Yes, the creators are successful, but it's a very small percentage that can use that success for leverage. I would even say that percentage is less than 1, because we recently had a massive infringement and by a political party, and I don't think it's even resolved yet. And this was an infringement of our top earning musicians in Kenya. I won't mention any names because I think it's still a sensitive topic. But and that just goes to show you how impunity reigns in this area. So I think what's really key, just to wrap up, is just maintaining law and order and doing it in a very efficient manner. And I know we have a role as well to help the judiciary in terms of that learning curve. And I'm sure what we're seeing in Kenya is replicated all over Eastern Africa, probably in a worse situation. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thank you. I'll move to Chola to tell us more about South Africa in terms of dispute resolution. What can the system do for you guys? Is there any system to begin with that is directly affecting or assisting copyright infringement matters?
I think one of the first things is that, and I use this example, in the intellectual property family, copyright is sort of the forgotten stepchild, because when you have things like patents and trademarks, those are regulated. We know what the rules are. We know what application forms to fill. We know what to pay. We know it's easier to track. It's easier to enforce, and it's taken a lot more seriously than a copyright, which is a more like tenuous concept for a lot of people. The rules are not so clear, even though we have an act, in terms of how it actually operates on a practical level. the rules are not so clear, and that knowledge is held, for instance, with the lawyers. It's held with CMOs, it's held with executives, and not necessarily the practitioners, copyright practitioners themselves. So you find that, because of that, it's very difficult to put a peg in the ground in terms of a lot of things with the law, with policy, etc. And our lawmakers in particular have grappled with that because they don't understand copyright at all. And because of that, and this is the point that Mike makes, is that certain influences have managed to find their way into the system and have managed to present a view about copyright, which will ultimately benefit them and not content creators. So for one, I think our lawmakers need to understand the laws that they are passing. That's imperative. That's not what's transpiring here. I think content creators also need to understand the environment within which they operate, so that they can hold the lawmakers accountable and not just leave it to the suits. So, for instance, I'm a copyright practitioner, but I'm not a content creator, and it sometimes feels as though I'm doing what I'm doing just to keep a paycheck. But there's a bigger picture here that needs to be understood. But if we don't have the content creators on our side, it makes it a lot difficult to convince the lawmakers. So they must understand copyright. They must hold themselves accountable as lawmakers, because they're making decisions which will impact not just my generation, but my children and my children's children will be impacted by the type of legislation that they pass. Also, agreeing with Mike's speed, 10 years. It's been 10 years harping on the same legislation, and we're probably going to go for a few more other years where we are shouting at the top of our voices about what's wrong with this act, but they keep on going back and passing, or putting in the same provisions, which are ultimately going to hurt content creators, which are going to hurt the South African economy, because there are investment implications for having this type of legislation. There are trade implications for having this type of legislation. It has an impact on other areas of the economy, but that understanding is not there. And also the working in the silos. So you'll find one portfolio committee within Parliament is looking at this from one angle, or is looking at the law, very strictly in a silo, and another portfolio committee is also maybe looking at it from a different perspective, but they're not looking at it holistically and seeing how they can draft a piece of legislation that is fit for purpose for the country. Everything's just very scattered. And you tend to find that approach in a lot of lawmaking within our jurisdiction. And that's one of the other things that they need to change. So for me, really understand what you're doing, hold yourself accountable, act with more speed, because at the rate at which we're going, even if we have we come up with perfect wording for copyright legislation in this country, technology would have overtaken us, and we need to start the process, all over again. So they need to function in that way as lawmakers. And for me, that's just my input with regards to what's happening here at home.
Angie, sitting at IFPI, what are any observations that you're making in terms of dispute resolution? What the system can do to help in terms of even listening to matters around copyright infringement?
Firstly, congratulations. I don't think any of us said congratulations on your new appointment. I think if your tribunal, for example, would take on more cases, because it's comprised of people who actually understand copyright, have a deeper understanding on what's happening, can be able to tackle those issues, then that would be an ideal situation. However, since that's not what is there, I think, especially if we're talking about, anti-piracy, and especially now online piracy, and what we've discussed throughout this conversation. And take, for example, website blocking. You see, there are various ways that you can deal with it. You can either have voluntary agreements, which is what we've been trying to do with PAP, but it's not going that well. We're hoping that the DSPs will be able to come on board and actually just have voluntary agreements. And these have worked in other countries like Denmark, Portugal, Spain, most of the EU countries, Germany, I think Netherlands even. So it's something that's already working. And I think that would be a better approach to actually have that, so we don't really even get into the disputes in the first place. Or if there's a dispute, then we know how to handle under the particular MOU. I think the provisions, if you look at, for example, if you take the EU copyright directive, there are some, there's an article that actually deals with this. you can have a civil, legal basis, which is available, and Holly can tell us more, because I think the US is one of the countries that actually have recent decisions confirming legal basis for this. And of course, criminal law. This is a crime, and I know Mike has always been saying we should be looking at it under which act is this? Mike, people say we should look at it under
Cybercrime Act.
Cybercrime Act.
Sorry.
It is a crime. So criminal law. Yes, there's other countries, I think Brazil and Belgium, who have this in place, and then also their administrative procedures. So all this, and I think we have examples around the world that we can be able to look at and actually, especially in our region, which is just getting to know, what's happening, this ISP liability and everything. But I think critically is us to actually concentrate on just, if we are able to just speak on that website blocking and have like even a central discussion or legislation around it through maybe if you talk about AFCFTA, for example, this is our opportunity. Right now we're discussing the IP protocol. This is an opportunity to actually put in, minimum standards, that we can be able to have to actually enforce and reduce, overall piracy. And it's an opportunity for us to work on it on a regional, basis. There are some impact studies that have been done, and maybe I'll just share as Holly. There's one which was done, I think it's called the effect of piracy website blocking on consumer behavior. It was published in 2019, and I think that's one that I'll just share. Maybe I'll look for it and I'll just share on the chat so that we can just even read how important this is and how we can be able to use, these platforms or ways of how to even avoid in the first place all these issues. Because I'm trying to figure out, once you have infringed on someone's rights or infringed on a copyright, or like basically piracy, it's a dispute because most probably you knew that you're going to to a place to actually bring down to you're selling products and using people's music without paying. So I don't think, for example, ADRs would be a good way of addressing it, because this is something, it's like a thief. You want to now start sitting with a thief to start discussing how you stole, and no. I think we just need to deal with it as it is, and have some stern measures so that we just avoid it in the first place, and we're able to actually deal with it accordingly. So I'm hoping if this comes to your desk, you can be able to deal with it in a manner, and all this have no pressure. I know we're not supposed to be pressuring judges, but you can deal with it in a way that you can put, for example, fines that are actually deterrent. That's the word, deterrent, and not small fines that even if I go ahead and do my piracy, I get more than even what the fine is. No, that doesn't make sense. So having all those issues in place and dealings, I think would be the best way forward.
Thanks, Angie. Moving on to you, Holly. In terms of dispute resolution, how is that like in the US? Is it as expedient as we imagine? From where we stand, we always like, oh my gosh, the US is doing so great, because at the end of the day, most of our precedents comes from you guys.
Well, you also did declare us the winners for the most number of people going on pirate sites and the most number of apps. So as much as we love to win for everything, I don't know if that's the one that we want to be the best for in terms of having the most number of people pirating content. That said, yes, I mean, look, I do think that we have a very strong copyright law. And as I mentioned, we now have the Protect Lawful Streaming Act. I think that was a good one to help shore up our criminal penalties. But I think you can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not being enforced, it doesn't matter. And I know that's something that, obviously you have to go through the judicial system like you did recently in Kenya with the multi-choice case and the other cases that are coming. I think that means you need education at all levels of the judicial process. That starts with the investigators, the prosecutors, And of course, the judges themselves. A lot of judges are handling these huge dockets with criminal cases and white collar crime. And then they've got some counterfeit and piracy cases in there, and kind of, seeing that these cases are just as important, if not more important than other kinds of financial crimes, I think is really key. I think Kenya is fortunate that it does have its own copyright tribunal. I think to the extent that you can have these specialized courts that can be or sort of alternative courts, quasi-judicial structures that can be very helpful. Just this year in the United States, the U.S. Copyright Office launched its Copyright Claims Board, which functions as somewhat of a small claims court is the right term, but it provides an alternative avenue to federal court for litigants to go before a panel of judges just who are specialized in copyright related disputes. So this can somewhat free up the courts for some of these sort of smaller cases, just because, and I say smaller, even though some of the litigants are quite large that are bringing these cases, there is a cap in the amount of damages that can be awarded. So I guess the last thing I wanted to mention is that the education also has to be at the consumer level as well. I think, as you all were mentioning before, as more people become content creators, it becomes easier to see the consequences of piracy when their music gets stolen or their content gets stolen. I hate to say they learn the hard way, but that is a way that people can identify more with the harms of piracy, that it is not victimless and that it actually is hurting people both, financially and creatively. It's really disincentivizing the further creation of different types of art. So I think that the education has to be really at all levels, of course, also with the lawmakers as well. But it's really about making sure that these laws are exercised and that there are strong deterrent penalties that are given out as well.
Thanks. I think, Mike, you had a question for Holly.
Yeah, I was very interested to hear from Holly about piracy as a service, and this is probably a follow-up. I know we've had some correspondence. There's one day I got an idea that we actually logged into a piracy site, and it says powered by Cloudflare. And Cloudflare is a legitimate company in the US that powers a lot of legitimate websites. And unfortunately is being used to power a lot of illegitimate websites as well. And what's interesting about that for our viewers is software companies are also based on intellectual property. Developers are as creative as any musician and filmmaker. So it's very interesting that a company based on IP would make its technology available to IP. And just to follow up on that, it's being hypocritical, right? But it is business, right? At the end of the day, and there's a fine line between business and ethics, unfortunately. And then not long after, Angela advised me and shared a case of where IFPI had a successful outcome in Italy against Cloudflare for empowering, infringing sites. So I'm just wondering, we're all in this fight together. I'm just wondering if another way, we can take it from the consumer angle, but we can also take it from, essentially, if you want to stop a car, you take the wheels off at the end of the day. And there's another way that we can also begin stemming this piracy by holding those companies accountable. So I'm just kind of wondering what's happening in the US around that in terms of legislation to be able to deal with what is essentially piracy as a service, because they are contributing to piracy as Cloudflare.
Sure. Yeah. So when I use the term piracy of a service, that term has become, it's a new term of art. I think that refers more to the sort of self-sufficient, I want to be a pirate, here, let me buy a software kit so I can be my own pirate TV operator. That said, I hear what you're saying, and it's a really fine line, right? I mean, there have been lawsuits against some of these cyber lockers or other services, stream ripping services, I mean, that are providing both legal and illegal services. You say, you know, you can go back to Napster, talking about a technology, or LimeWire, Kazaa. I mean, those were really big maybe 15, 20 years ago. God, 20 years ago is a long time. But when I was using, you know, and I'll be honest, when I was in college, I mean, those were all the rage. And those were a new technology based on IP for infringing IP. And I think we have a really strong ethos in this country of, you know, kind of letting businesses do their thing. So we're very reluctant to shut down or really penalize companies that unless they are knowingly engaging in this unlawful behavior. I'll say that, you know, especially I'm thinking again with the recent legislation back on the sort of e-commerce marketplace side is, you know, you have these companies that are selling a mix of both very legitimate or mostly legitimate products, but then some of these counterfeit products leak onto their sites. And where do you draw the line? I will say that one way that we've been kind of addressing these is the U.S. Trade Representative puts out a couple of annual reports every year. I think I mentioned that that's something that our office is involved in, and that's the Special 301 report, which looks at sort of countries that don't have their laws where we'd like to see them, but also the notorious markets list. That's something we're actually starting that process just right now. The report is usually published in the early part of the new year. And increasingly, we're seeing a lot of the sites listed are these different piracy sites. And some of them are the traditional streaming services, but you're seeing cyber lockers and VPNs and these other kinds of services that are being used to facilitate piracy. Now, does naming and shaming them take them down? Not necessarily. But at the same time, we are seeing a lot more cross or transnational operations with the US or involving foreign countries and really trying to put a tamp down on these sites. So, you know, in the United States, our Homeland Security investigation has Operation In Our Sites, SITES, sort of a cheeky name for taking down sites that offer, you know, pirated content and counterfeit content. And we also recently, I think it's been actually a multi-year ongoing investigation or operation with Brazil. It's called Operation 404. And I know just this summer, they took down several sites for pirated content. So I think it's thinking both domestically on legislation and otherwise, but it's also about collaborating internationally. It's exciting being able to you know, get all this content from all over the world. But on the other hand, we have to collaborate internationally too, because these pirate sites aren't just one place all the time.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Holly. So now I think we'll answer the questions on the Q&A. And as we are answering them, the panelists I shall assign the question will also make their remarks in terms of what next, what are we expecting from your organization, any short-term, long-term type of goals. So I'll start with the first question. Ashley Mugo from Kenya is asking, what support can legal fraternity in Kenya give to support the content creators? I'll give that to Mike. To answer that, because Ashley is a lawyer based in Nairobi and she'd like to know how she would assist or the legal fraternity can assist. Then the second question is by by Bob Maura. He's a creative, also I think from Kenya. And he asks, is there a way of legally copywriting or patenting online? I'll give that to Angela. And then for both Holly and Chola, the question by Karen Wanjao, also an IP practitioner from Nairobi. What is the practicability of online dispute resolution mechanism with regard to copyright infringement, seeing that some of these incidences span over various jurisdictions? So we'll start with you, Mike, and then Angela, and then Chola and Holly.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you, Ashley, for offering your assistance. So we won't say no. We never say no. Partners Against Piracy is a coalition. It's a coalition of stakeholders. The legal fraternity is very much a stakeholder. And I think Liz and Angela would agree that there's probably more cases than there are IP lawyers in Kenya at the moment. And we would encourage more of the legal fraternity to get into it. It's the next growth industry in Kenya, and it's the next industrial revolution of Africa. So it's a good way. It's really a good idea to get into the creative industry and the IP industry. I will drop an email address for Partners Against Piracy in the chat. Anyone who's in this session can also reach out to us and join us as members. We are currently just formalizing our registration and drawing up our constitution and what have you, but we will have different levels of membership from individual all the way up to corporate, and there'll be various benefits associated with membership. But yes, please join us. Once you're with us, then we do have a governance and legal team that Liz actually leads. And I know she's looking for help on that team, and we have various other teams as well that could deal with some legal help as well. That one is the enforcement team. We also have a communications and awareness team as well. So let me drop the email, reach out to us, and I'll refer you to our membership and partnerships team so you can learn about how to join us. Thank you.
Mike, also make your parting shots.
Oh, okay, I've just done it. I'm gonna drop an email address into the chat for those who want to join us. I did it without thinking. Thank you.
All right, Angela, on to you.
Okay, so Bob, maybe but first to just clarify what a patent is, and basically it's usually the rights, the IP for an invention. So which it can either be a product or a process. It provides just general way of doing something, or might offer a new technical solution to a problem. So what we're talking about in this case, we're talking about content. I guess we're talking about content, music, whatever, film. They will be talking about copyright. The beauty about copyright, as opposed to other intellectual property rights, is that it's an automatic right. So once it's fixated, and by fixating is that, of course, we mean writing it down, recording it, doing something that you're fixated. It's that the law says that's when you get your copyright. But it's automatic, meaning you don't really have to register to get your copyright. That's the beauty about it. But in Kenya, I can see Maura, I guess you're in Kenya, we have the Kenya Copyright Board, which has a voluntary registration system where you can actually just go online and you're able to register your works just to state when the registration was, just in case there's a dispute. And this can be done in various ways. If you find that it's very expensive, I would say you can do alternative ways, because a long time ago, when you didn't have this technology, people actually used to take their CDs or their cassettes and actually post them to themselves and not open it until the day there's a dispute. So I say these days you can actually maybe email yourself and you have a date of when the copyright work was actually created. So, but of course, having a proper system like what Equitable has is really critical to moving forward. And I believe it is online. I can be able to go online just now and try and get the link for you, and I'll post it on the chat. Yeah.
Thanks, Angie. Next up to you, Chola and Holly.
Chola, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Liz. In terms of practicability from an international perspective, I think I'll leave that one to Holly, but I will share from a South African perspective that we struggle with copyright infringement cases. If you even do a search, you struggle to find legal precedent in South Africa dealing with copyright infringement, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of the issues, obviously, is access to the courts, the money to fund copyright infringement cases, the lack of precedent that we do have here, getting rights holders themselves to institute proceedings for copyright infringement. Even when there is a dispute that comes aboard, there's a problem with evidence, there's a problem with getting witnesses, there are problems with regards to the platforms that they need to utilize in order to ventilate their issues. So we struggle locally with copyright infringement cases, and I can only imagine how difficult it would be if we had to deal, for instance, with an international case. But I think going forward, we are trying to develop our law. I know from a SAMRO perspective, we are moving now to become quite aggressive with regards to copyright infringement in our jurisdiction, and looking to progress matters to a point where we do get some precedent and some judgments with regards to how we deal with copyright and copyright infringement in South Africa. And hopefully we can learn, from what's happened in the US, because the US has had a long history of jurisprudence and litigation in the copyright space that we do learn from, but we do need something locally that we can we can work with and apply as well. And just in terms of my parting shots, there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's a lot of good work that is being done, particularly in Kenya, and I look forward to further engaging all the panelists here in terms of what we could do in the South African context. Thanks.
Thanks, Chola.
Thank you.
Holly?
Sure. So I do think that, the international aspect of copyright issues, which again, now that we're digital, we're going to see more and more of, is a challenging one. I've got to say, there's not, jurisdiction was not a subject in law school that I was particularly fond of. In the copyright space, we do have international conventions like the Berne Convention, and that provides us certain minimums, or also through the TRIPS Treaty as well, about the protection and enforcement of copyright. So we have this idea that we don't have formalities, that we don't require someone to formally register their work with the Copyright Office in order to bring a lawsuit here in the United States, although we do enforce that requirement on our US citizens, which is kind of interesting. But if you're a foreign citizen, so if you're someone who's abroad and you want to bring a copyright lawsuit in the United States, you do not have to register with the U.S. Copyright Office. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But in terms of whether a court can retain jurisdiction over a particular case, unfortunately, that's going to fall back not on the Berne Convention, but just on traditional jurisdiction, which is not anything that's necessarily, codified, but not in the broad sense. It has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So a court's going to be looking at, where the harm was felt. So in a case of international copyright, it might look at, where is the rights holder? Are they based in that particular country? Where is, if it's in a digital case, where is the server? Where is the infringer based? Where is the host based? They might not all be in the same place. So I think all of these cases are going to be really fact specific. But to the extent that you can establish jurisdiction in your home country, I think it's always easiest to bring a lawsuit in a case in a place where you're, comfortable with the laws. When we're speaking with U.S. stakeholders, we always say, can you find a nexus to the United States? Is there a way we can bring the case into the United States courts? It's not always going to work, but to the extent that you can find that nexus and apply the laws of your home country, that's usually easiest. And in terms of parting shots, I just wanted to thank Liz and Mike and everyone else who convened this wonderful meeting. It's been a real privilege to be here with all of you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Holly. So I think at this point, we first want to thank the panelists for joining us, taking some time out from your busy schedules to be with us, to have these amazing conversations with us, and to, we share and break IP bread. Pauline, we take note of your question. After this, we have the networking session. So please feel free to join my networking room, and we'll have more conversations around that question that you have raised. Each of the panelists has networking rooms, so please join the respective networking rooms. And if you want, you can also rotate around and meet and greet various people and the panelists. So you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. I don't know, Mike, if we'll get this recording one time at some point, but I think this was a very good session. And thank you, Mike, for the work that you do for the industry. For those who do not know, Mike is actually the genius behind ONGEA. Started many years ago as Kenya Music Week, and I think he's one of our unsung heroes. So thank you, everyone. Have a good morning, good evening, and good night.
Thank you, Liz, for those kind words. I'm also passing it on to our hardworking team here in the studio, behind the scenes. Courtney, Liza, thank you very much. So, guys, I double up as a voiceover, so I'll just do this on camera. So, thank you once again on behalf of ONGEA, the 7th annual Eastern Africa Music Summit. Thank you for generously sharing of your experience and your time to our panelists. We are now going one-on-one into the rooms. So those of you who are with us, you just click back and to the reception area, you click on the tab called Networking. You'll see some rooms in there. We'll also do the same when the session ends. Our rooms have our names on, and then you can rotate between the rooms. You can chat to us. We're going to be in those rooms for the next, it's 45 minutes now, 40 minutes. We've gone over on this panel, 50 minutes rather. We've gone over on this panel, but we'll be with you for the next 50 minutes. If anyone wants to stay on, the rooms will be open. We have apologies from Holly. She has other commitments. Thank you, Holly, for your time. I know this won't be the last time that we meet you, so we'll have further engagements as well from Eastern Africa with you. All right, guys, so thank you so much. Let's now jump into the rooms, enjoy, and then when the rooms are done, I'll sign out for the day as well. Thank you so much.